Mr. Fanda Falconi, Foreign Affairs Minister of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente de la Mesa Directiva,
Mr. President, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to pass on the brotherly welcome from the Ecuadorian people to all representatives and all peoples of the world. For some time, we have known that the increase of the greenhouse effect as a consequence mainly of the combustion of fossil fuels by the over-consuming societies of the North is a problem that we're facing. In 1895, the chemist Svante Arrhenius explained how, when the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up, the atmospheric temperature would go up and climate change would take place. Why has it taken so much time to have a political and economic debate on this question if the economic growth is tied to growing emissions? In 2007 and in 2008, there was a peak of CO2 emissions. In 2009, however, they have dropped. These levels have dropped 3% all over the world. Will this be a final peak, or is it a peak in a sort of a mountain chain pattern which will take us all to climate disaster? These are the main questions that humanity faces at this time. The slowdown in the emissions in 2009 has been caused by the economic financial crisis and not because of international commitments. A small drop in the world, in the GDP, leads to a greater decrease in CO2 emissions, and this is taken together with the increase in energy efficiency. In addition, there are investments in wind and solar energy. However, this drop is insufficient. This reduction is insufficient. We should commit ourselves as nations, as states, to have a reduction of 50 to 60% swiftly, as the IPCC tells us we should do. However, before continuing with our commitments of reduction, we have to ask ourselves the following question: who should lower emissions? Can it be the poorest in the world who will swiftly reduce their CO2 emissions? There are necessary emissions and there are deluxe emissions. The differences per capita are very great. 20 tons of CO2 per person per year in the very rich economies. 20 tons. And less than 3 tons in the impoverished economies. The reduction of emissions must be made by the countries that are above the tolerable world average, which are the ones who have produced historically and currently the lion's share of the CO2 emissions. The non-industrialized countries are sort of like passive smokers. We suffer because of the disproportionate combustion of oil, gas, and carbon of the rich countries, and also for the deforestation caused by exterior demand, poorly paid for biomass. The historic differentiated responsibility of the industrialized country has been recognized all the way back in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, but has not been implemented efficiently. The recognition of the acknowledgement of this ecological debt as a result of historic responsibilities of the rich countries would make it possible to translate the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities into something real. It's urgent to encourage initiatives that seek to establish a mechanism that can measure this debt and can determine the responsibility of the countries of the North. The funds that will come from the payment of this historic ecological debt could be channeled into the conservation of forests and biodiversity, also to the adaptation of vulnerable ecosystems and human groups, to the energy transition and avoid in this way the emission of GHGs. It's not a question of having developed countries give credits for adaptation or mitigation, because the poor countries do not have a historic responsibility, or it's very, very minor for the climate change, and much less that these credits should act as new mechanisms to throw into debt the countries of the South. We're talking about an ethical question based on the acknowledgement of the developed countries of their financial responsibility and, above all, the social responsibility for generations current and future. I'm referring with this to a new environmental adjustment. To pay your historic debt is like paying a fine. It's not a license to continue along the same path. The payment of a climate debt must begin through the results that have to be agreed in this COP15, and it must respond to a sustained and equitable process. And we have to have international courts that will adjudicate on this sort of debt. My government demands that the agreements achieved in this forum should guarantee an increase of temperature which is lower than 1.5 degrees, not 2 degrees, as has been said by the representatives of the EU and the European Commission. In terms of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we are reaching 400 parts per million. It is simply unthinkable to reach 450 parts per million. In Ecuador, in the Andes, in Central Asia, the glaciers are disappearing. There is an ecological debt. There is also a climate debt. There's a carbon debt from those who have disproportionately emitted greenhouse gases. There is a rating of the financial system. Some countries have an A, other countries have B. But in terms of the ecological debt, the ratings should be C, D, E, and F, and many countries do not want to face their responsibilities and the commitments that they already have assumed under the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. Ecuador is aware of the responsibility vis-à-vis the environment, and it has positioned itself on the global level as a nation that takes unilateral initiatives, voluntary initiatives, and with public funds. It is not basing this on aid. Ecuador is not only asking for reparations, but is offering an initiative which is called the Yasuni ITT initiative, the same one which demonstrates the willingness of Ecuador to make an economic sacrifice out of respect for the uncontacted indigenous peoples who live in a corner of the Amazon to benefit the preservation of an unparalleled biodiversity, which is of interest to everyone gathered here. And in order to avoid the production of more than 400 million tons of CO2 that would be the result of the combustion of about 850 million barrels of crude oil that is under the ground in that natural reserve. This initiative is revolutionary compared to the mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol, considering the fact that it seeks the compensation to avoid carbon emissions, whereas the other proposals are seeking the absorption of those emissions. The second example that we could share with you is the so-called Daily Correa eco-tax. Ecuador is a country that exports oil. It's a member of OPEC. The government of President Rafael Correa already proposed back in 2007 an eco-tax by the OPEC countries for oil exports. In other words, it's a sort of an environmental holding tax of 3% in principle that should lower the demand and, as a result, the CO2 emissions. The income could be channeled to social aims and facilitate the transition towards sustainable energies. This eco-tax should also be applied to other fuels, which are exported proportional to their environmental impact. These initiatives respond to an interest and an effort to contribute to the setting up of a new international financial system. The proposal to generate environmental criteria in new financial institutions opens the door to a collective establishment of a new type of environmental governance which should regulate the framework of the international climate change regime. Ecuador sees this era of crisis as an opportunity to make really deep changes that would make it possible to transform our societies. And for this reason, my delegation is very troubled by what is happening at the summit. Lack of agreements and secret consultations and discussions that threaten the result that humanity expects from this summit. For us, the earth, nature, the physical medium is an integral part of the fundamental principle of our constitution, the sumac causae, as we call it, or a life in harmony. Our Constitution turns this into a nature, which is an entity which is actionable under the law, recognizing the right of all of its vital cycles and that they should be respected, preserved, and regenerated. This is the principle of a life in harmony. It is the basis for the policies, economic and social policies that are being applied by the government of Ecuador in order to overcome social inequity. Thank you very much.